Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College, and I'm thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group, the last virtual reading group of 2025. It's been an eventful year. Let's just all note that. And also the final session of our reading together of the book on revolution, Hannah Arendt's last completed book, um, and really, I think her most mature book. You know, it's the book that oh man, excuse me about that. It's the book that more than really any of her others articulates her political philosophy, um, her idea of what it would mean to live a free and meaningful life. I use those two words, free and meaningful, with utter intention. Um, I've said this a number of times in the last year or two, but to me, when people ask me what is why should someone read Hannah Arendt? What's Hannah Arendt about? Um, I think that the answer is that for Hannah Arendt, um, human life is about freedom. It's about what does it mean to be free. But even more than that, um, it is about what does it mean to live a meaningful life. Uh, uh, how does one, as a human being, live? Not just live, right? This is where she thinks we differ from animals, and it's one of the reasons she is so uncomfortable with the idea of human rights. Because for her to live is not to be kept alive, whether in a camp or by food or as a refugee. Um, but to live is to live a life in which you can appear, speak, and act in public in ways that matter, which is a freedom that we have. Um, of course, it's also a freedom that we have uh, to not appear and to live a private life, and that's how this book will end, with that choice. And um, the book is going to end with a discussion of elitism that very few people in the Arendtian world ever consider, because they either don't notice it or just find it problematic. Um, but Arendt wants to basically say in the end that uh, elitism, when it's chosen, is okay, and we'll get there at the end of the book. But it is an extraordinary book and last chapter. We started chapter 6, which is titled "The Revolutionary Tradition and Its Lost Treasure," in our last session, which was a few weeks ago. Um, and as we talked about, Arendt is originally talking about two institutions that she thinks were essential to the American Revolution. Right. So first of all, there were two forces of the revolutionary spirit that she talks about. One is the active foundation, the experience of starting something anew. That's the revolutionary idea, that you begin something anew. But also, the other force of the revolutionary spirit was a concern with durability and stability, and that both of these were absolutely important. And there were two institutions, she thought, that the American founders imagined and created, um, which were essential to the second aspect of the revolutionary tradition, namely this grave concern with stability and durability. One, okay. There were two institutions that she thought were essential to this, to achieving this grave concern with stability and durability. One was the Supreme Court, right? And we talked about this in chapter 5, where for her, the Supreme Court, which in a sense dressed up in robes and acted as almost uh, a reincarnation, her words, right? Not mine, a reincarnation of the founding generation, interpreting the Constitution through the spirit of the founding, provides a kind of authority, uh, which provides durability and stability to the United States Republic. And the other institution that she turns to is the United States Senate. Um, the importance of the Senate was that uh, it was an institution that allowed for what she calls the formation of public views in the structure of the republic against public opinion, which can lead to tyranny, simply what people believe. And the problem with public opinion is people just believe whatever they want, and they can be molded by demagogues and rhetoric and all sorts of algorithms today, right? Um, Against public opinion, she thought that the only way to get to a public spirited idea was through conversation, was through discussion. She said only in the debate and deliberation amongst a small group of people can we purify public opinion and purify self-interest into a kind of um, uh, tested and exchange of opinions that leads to a public spirit. And she quotes here Federalist 49, where she says, the reason of man is timid and cautious when left alone, and acquires firmness and confidence in the proportion to the number with which is it associated. You need to talk to people through this public idea. And, we can turn back to her lectures on Kant's political philosophy, actually written later, which would have been the third part of her book, Life of the Mind. And in that idea, the essential aspect of public thinking, that you test your opinions against other people and you be willing to change your opinions based on listening to other people, whether in actual conversation or an imaginary conversation, as she imagines with Kant. And so the Senate is this essential institution of American government, along with the Supreme Court, that provides for some sort of durability and stability. The failure of the revolution, right, was, however, that it provided no institution for the other side, right? We said there were two forces of the American Revolution. One was stability and durability, but the other was the founding of the new, the experience of being part of the public world, the experience of revolution. And that, she said, was left out of the Constitution. And here's where she begins to turn to Thomas Jefferson and his idea of these ward systems, of an idea that what was left out of the Constitution were spaces of freedom, spaces in which people could gather, like in the old town halls or in small town government. And this is where we pick up the story in part 3 of chapter 6 uh, on revolutionary councils. And so she begins part 3 with this quote from Cato, where he had concluded that Carthago delenda est, right? Carthago must be destroyed. He said, I'm going to end every speech with this word that Carthage must be destroyed. Cato did. And Jefferson says, so do I end every opinion with the injunction, divide the counties into wards. We need to create these smaller political institutions that were not provided for by the U.S. Constitution. Arendt calls this Jefferson's most cherished political idea, right? The ward and council system, she thinks, represents an entirely new form of government, a new public space for freedom, which was constituted and organized during the course of the revolution itself. So, right, just as the Senate and the Supreme Court were institutions for authority and for a public spirit, what we now needed was an institution for public freedom. And what Jefferson came to realize, and the letters in which he writes these ideas down are after he's retired, after he's already been both Secretary of State and President, um, that he imagined these elementary republics, she says, um, which anticipated the revolutions, like the Soviet Revolution and the Hungarian Revolution. But these councils, these wards that Jefferson imagined, were utopian. And here's where Arendt, when I said this is her most mature book of political theory, yes, it's also her most utopian. And whether utopian and maturity go together is an interesting question. But these councils that Jefferson imagined were for Arendt, um, uh, unheard of. They were new forms of government, new public spaces for freedom. And she says there were only two exceptions where they'd been sort of imagined prior. One was a few remarks during the Paris Commune in 1870, uh, yeah, 1871, and the other in Lenin's few remarks about the Soviets, the power of the Soviets during the 1905 revolution in Russia. Um, and so Arendt wants to look into what Jefferson means by these wards, these little republics. And she says they're not in his formal works. They were sort of an afterthought of sorts. And yet, the core is that he came to realize that in both federal and state institutions that the Constitution created, all of the institutions of representation were too large to admit of what he called immediate participation. Um, and this led to a fundamental problem. And it's a problem of that Arendt calls corruption. Now, I think this is one of the more interesting aspects of Arendt's work here. And I just gave a talk in Berlin earlier this week, where I talked a fair bit about this idea of corruption, and people really responded to it. But I think it's actually quite difficult to get a grasp on exactly what Arendt means by corruption. Um, I'm on page 254 in the first edition, 243 in the Penguin edition. Um, and Arendt here says that corruption in a representative democracy with constitutional protections against tyranny, a democracy like the United States, right? We have constitutional protections and separation of powers and and judicial review and things like that. Corruption is not likely to come, she says, from a conspiracy of the representative organs against the people whom they represent. And this is, I think, a very important insight of hers, and I think it's right, but we can talk about it. She says it's unlikely that tyranny will emerge in a country like the United States from either the Congress or the presidency, right? Something we can all think about today. She says that corruption, which is in her mind the core of tyranny, um, is much more likely to spring not from the representative organs, but from the midst of society, that is, from the people themselves. It's on page 255 and 243. The representative institutions, she says, are corrupted not by the representatives, but from the people. And the reason for this is, as she says on 255 and 244, she says, corruption and perversion are more likely to occur in an egalitarian republic than in any other form of government. Right? And this is because, schematically speaking, corruption and perversion come to pass when private interests invade the public domain. That is when they spring from below and not from above. What does she mean? She means that in an egalitarian republic, the people have a claim to be part of the ruling class. They share part of the public power in a democracy. Um, Even if it's only by voting, they share part of that public power. And what they learn then is to manipulate power. The people learn to manipulate power for their own factional and private interests. And so the people turn away from the public spirit towards factional or private interests. Right? We all know this, and we talk about how, well, you can't get rid of factions, so what you do is you push factions against each other, right? This is one of Madison's great insights, and Roald Dahl, American political theorist, sort of makes this core of his understanding of American politics. Um, but for Arendt, this is a corruption. And she says that whereas for older republics, the danger was that the rulers would trespass on private interests and they would, in a sense, take away our rights. And in those older republics, therefore, the best guarantee or remedy against tyranny was private property, because you would then have a way to keep the ruler out of your rights. And that another remedy against the corruption of the government would be a Bill of Rights, right? And she thought the American Bill of Rights was the last legal bulwark for the private realm against the public power. But it's different in an egalitarian republic. And in an egalitarian republic, in a time of rapid economic growth and the expansion of the private realm, she says the dangers of corruption are more likely to arise from private interests than public power. Namely, factional interests will take over, manipulate the government, and seek to turn the government against others. She says that Jefferson saw this, and that the republics and councils and wards that he proposed were designed to protect the public spirit or the revolutionary spirit. I think this is a very powerful but also difficult idea that she's developing, right? That corruption, as she understands it, isn't bribery, isn't decadence, isn't even elite rot. It is the deformation of the public realm by private logic. Corruption happens, for Arendt here, when the people exercise political power as private persons, carrying into public life the habits and incentives and passions that properly belong to the household, the market, or the faction. This is a very, old-fashioned Republican idea that Arendt is here developing, right? That you need a kind of public virtue to govern. Now it's a strange argument for her to be making, because so much of chapters 4 and 5 on the Constitution of Liberty were about how one of the geniuses of the American Republic was to create a faction, to not do away with factions, but to multiply factions, to create a dispersion of power and a multiplication of powers that would prevent any one power from governing. But she's making a very important and I think meaningful amendment to that claim, which is that the dispersion of powers and the separation of powers and the federalist principle in the United States can protect us from tyranny, or as well as anything. They may not fully succeed, but they're as good an attempt to protect us from tyranny as we have. The machinery of government, the machinery of the division of powers is as strong a protection as we have. Whether it will work or not is still an open question. But Jefferson was concerned with a different kind of danger, not tyranny, but corruption, the corruption of the public realm. he came to see that in conditions of prosperity and a growing private realm, right, of abundance, um, the people would, in a sense, um, care more about their private interests. And that's okay if they're just private people. But because we're in an egalitarian republic and the private people also rule, they would begin to elect people who cared more about their private interests than the public interests. The point is that we created a system, Jefferson said, in which the representatives, which Madison and Hamilton thought would be people who cared about the public interest, would would become corrupted because the people became corrupted, and they would elect people who cared more about pursuing their private interest over the public interest. And what Jefferson saw, Arendt writes, is that the Constitution had given all power to the citizens without giving the citizens the opportunity of being participants in government, without the possibility of acting as citizens. And so you'd given people power, but you'd given it to the people in their private capacity. And you had no space left to train them to be citizens so that they could decide and learn how to govern according to a public spirit. And without a citizenry of virtue, um, Arendt says the danger is that we will lose the public spirit. We will lose this sense that people govern because they want to build a free country, and instead they will simply be representatives of people, of the citizens and their private interests, and everything will become about the pursuit of interest. And so Arendt argues that the Republican government or free government demands the subdivision of the counties into wards, namely the creation of small republics through which every man in the state could be educated into becoming a public spirited person, could become what she calls an acting member of the common government, transacting in person a great portion of its rights and duties. It was these little republics, these wards, that would train people to be public spirited and thus become the main strength of the great republic, as she puts it. And that's her argument in part 3 of chapter 6. We come to part 4, the last part of the book and the last part of chapter 6, and she says, look, the story of the revolutions of our time is not yet decided, right? So again, this is really textbook Arendt, right? On the one hand, we've lost the spirit. On the other hand, it's not yet decided. But she says it's also the story for these councils. And here is really where she develops, I think, her political theory. She says that in every revolution in the 19th and 20th century, we witnessed the irregular emergence during the course of the revolution of a new form of government that resembled in an amazing fashion Jefferson's ward system and the French revolutionary societies. This was true in the Paris Commune, it was true in the Russian Soviets, it was true in the Hungarian Revolution, and in others as well. The powerlessness of professional revolutionaries, right, was that they had little impact. Because Marx focused on the social question, he didn't really care about this question of freedom and participation in government. But the councils, she says, in all of these revolutions against the professional revolutionaries, against the revolutionary class, came out of nowhere. They had no tradition. They had no background. They just emerged. Outstanding amongst the council's common characteristics, she writes, is their spontaneity. And the other aspect that she highlights is that they were organs of order and organs of action. And this brought them into conflict with the professional revolutionaries who wanted to govern. who were not interested in letting the citizens be free, but were interested in things like welfare and the social question. And they sought to direct, uh, um, they sought to these councils, she thought, were not part of a political party, were not part of the Revolutionary Party, but they were for the people who belonged to no party. And she calls them spaces of freedom, right? The councils obviously were spaces of freedom, she writes on 268 and 256. And as spaces of freedom, the councils made all attempts at establishing themselves as permanent organs of a free government. They were a force in which contemporary witnesses could sense the emergence and formation of a force which one day might be able to affect the transformation of the state. She's here citing Oscar Ohnweiler, a German writer, about the Hungarian Revolution. But what she's getting at is that people witnessing these councils at the time saw them really as radically new forms of government. She says on 268 that it was nothing more or less than this hope for a transformation of the state, for a new form of government that would permit every member of the modern egalitarian society to become a participator in public affairs that was buried in the disasters of the 20th century revolutions. In a sense, the councils challenged the party system. They were more interested in political life than in accomplishing social equality. And they were thus political revolutions, right? And her turn to Hungary and Russia is that in both those revolutions, she thinks, these councils that emerged, right, which sprung up independently and of all kinds, the neighborhood councils, the revolutionary councils, the writers' councils, the artists' councils, the student councils, the youth councils, the workers' councils, the army councils. These councils just emerged and lasted long enough to begin to actually govern, to begin to actually organize themselves, and thus to show that they could be revolutionary organs of a new form of government, a new kind of republic. The common object, she says on 271, was the foundation of a new body politic, a new type of republican government, which would rest on elementary republics in such a way that its own central power did not deprive the constituent bodies of their original power to constitute. Namely, these new societies that emerged, these elementary republics, could start to govern, and they could give power to higher republics and higher bodies, but they would still retain power. And this was part of the federalist principle, the divisibility of power idea that she found was, in a sense, spontaneous in these revolutions. Now, in Britain and the United States, she says, we've come to realize that two-party government is better at controlling tyranny than multi-party systems like they have in Europe. Right. And the argument, she doesn't make that argument here, but she does make it in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. The argument is that two-party government incorporates the opposition into government. Because it's a 50-50 split, right? Whoever gets more than 50% of the vote is going to govern. The opposition always wants to win and to govern, because they are close. It's usually between 53 and 47 or 52 and 48. Usually elections in a two-party system are close. And the reason is because both parties have a tendency to move towards the middle. And as a result, the opposition has to be ready to govern, and it can't take crazy, outlandish positions. It has to actually try and actually find a majority. Whereas in a multi-party democracy, right, you can have people who get into the government with 5% of the vote or 8% of the vote, and they have some power, but they don't have to actually ever worry about governing. And this, she says, is a disadvantage. And that's why she thinks it's harder for a two-party system to become a tyranny, because the opposition is always close and also will have some power. They'll have, even if the president controls the White House, maybe if the opposition controlled the House at some point, and if they don't, they might still control some states. The point is, it's harder for one tyrant to be fully in charge in a two-party system. Um, but the expense of that, the difficulty of that, or the trade-off, is that in a two-party system, fewer and fewer people involved in politics, right? Fewer people who feel that the parties represent them. Fewer people who actually get involved. And you end up with a representative government, but not a participatory government. And on 272, she writes that the problem here is that, again, to go back to what I said about the Senate earlier in part 1 of chapter 6, opinions for her, or as opposed to public opinion, but good opinions, are formed in the process of open discussion and public debate. But in a system in which most people simply vote once a year and don't engage in discussion and debate, there's no opportunity for them to be in that discussion. No opportunity for them to learn how to argue with people they disagree with and to form a kind of filtered opinion. And she says on 272 that in such a situation, the people don't ever form meaningful opinions. What they actually do is they become overtaken by moods of the masses, right? People get caught up in moods of resentment, or moods of progress, or moods of anger and animosity, but they don't actually have the experience of having to figure out, well, what's my opinion? And the result is that mass movements arise from the people's suspicion and hostility against things that prevent their moods from being realized. Arendt now returns to this idea of the parties and the councils, or the council system. And she compares party politics to council politics. And she says that councils emerged during the revolution as a spontaneous organ of the people for action and order, whereas parties, she says, are extensions of parliamentary factions. And the parties seek the idea that the end of government is the welfare of the people, not freedom. And in a condition of an abundance, this is again one of her main points, politics then becomes about administration and not action. And so she says the councils made a fatal mistake, which is that they tried to become organs of administration. And when they did so, they lost their fundamental drive of freedom, and they've been failures everywhere, and nowhere have they survived. The book ends with these final few pages on what we might call the question of freedom and the elite, right? Remember, this whole book on Revolution was about freedom. The premise of On Revolution is, how do you found a free polity? How do you found a free government? I mean, and she's saying, that's what revolutions are. They're attempts to found freedom. And she separates liberty from freedom. And she says we need to constitute freedom. And we need institutions for both authority and power. Well, what is freedom? And in the end, she says here that freedom, wherever it has existed as a tangible reality, has always been spatially limited, right? This is something new. This is a new idea that she has here come to. Freedom is not something that's universal. It can only exist amongst equals, and equality is not universal, right? I mean, we all know this, and she wrote about this again also in her first major book, Origins of Totalitarianism, right? She says equality is not a natural accomplishment of man. We're all unequal. Equality is a political accomplishment. We create a politics in which we say we're all born equal, but that's not natural. That's political. That's artificial. But what she's saying is freedom can only exist in a space, in a polity in which we are all seen as equal. And thus, freedom can't exist in the world, like the whole world. This is why you need, right? This is against cosmopolitanism or against world government. You need limited spaces of freedom, of political action. And she says these spaces of freedom are like islands in a sea or oases in a desert. They're spaces of appearances, to go back to the language of the human condition. You need laws that set it up, and you need these spaces where I can equally talk and act freely with others. The problem is that you know, in the Congress or in the Supreme Court, you might have a space of freedom and oases, but it's for very few people. It's for the elite. And she says, so does that mean that only these very few people, the elite, can have freedom? And she says, well, it's never been the case that the political way of life, the free way of life, has been for the life of the many, right? There's never been a polity from Greek or any polity, Native Americans, any polity in which most people wanted to take part in the public uh, world. And she says, the political passions, courage, public happiness, excellence, may not be as rare as we think, but they're not ordinary. And the problem with the elite is that it's usually been an oligarchic elite, the rich or the powerful, who rule the few, who rule as the few and rule the many. But she says there's a misunderstanding here, right? Which is that the essence of government for her is not to rule, it is freedom, which means you need to protect these islands of freedom, these places where people can gather together as equals. But that means that you have to protect these spaces from the many, because the many don't respect these spaces. And she says today the elite are free in Parliament or Congress, but we don't have public spaces where everyday citizens can become part of the elite. Now, I mean, we could argue that there are spaces like that in our society. There are things like non-governmental institutions or protest movements where people emerge as leaders. But she means something different, not people who emerge out of interest groups, but emerge out of the public spirit, out of debating and thus forming opinions that are not interested opinions, but public spirited opinions. And she says the councils are the solution to this great problem of how to reconcile equality and authority. How can you both have equality, but also create authority? And her answer is that you create a pyramid scheme, right? Where the councils emerge and all the councils have people in them who debate and talk and are equal. But then leaders emerge, and the leaders of these councils get elected to go up to the next level of council. And they talk and they lead and they discuss and they filter opinion. And then the leaders emerge and they go up to the next council. And she says you end up with this kind of pyramid structure, right? Where on an egalitarian basis, you end up with authority at the top. And that's why she says it's a solution of how to reconcile equality and authority. Now, the problem, of course, is that authoritarian government, as she draws it, is also a pyramid with the ruler at the top and everyone else below. The difference, she says here, is that in authoritarian government, power and authority are filtered down from above. In the councils, they're generated at each layer on the measure of equality. Now, the problem here, right, is that if you took her seriously, as she says, you would get rid of general suffrage as we know it. Only the people who want to engage in politics would go to these councils and engage and voluntarily become members of these elementary republics and learn in doing so to care more for the public than their private interests. And they would rise up, and we would, out of this equality, lead to authority. But it would exclude people. It would exclude probably the majority of people, or at least a large number of people, who don't want to participate. Now, even in general suffrage, there's a lot of people who don't participate. So you could say that it's not that different, but you would probably exclude a lot more people under this system than under a system of general suffrage. But Arendt says, well, the exclusion is voluntary. And it reminds us of one of the fundamental rights that we all have, which is the right to be free from politics, the right to not care about politics, the right to just live our lives and not worry about politics. And that's the freedom of the private sphere. Um, and in a way, what she's saying is that in order to protect the revolutionary spirit, the joy of public happiness, you also have to protect the right to be free from politics. You need both. Um, and then she turns at the end to René Char, the wonderful French poet who became a resistance fighter during World War II, uh, who understood, as he wrote, that if I survive the war, I know that I shall have to break with the aroma of these essential years, silently reject, not repress my treasure. That he knew that his treasure, public participation, being part of the public sphere, um, which is the treasure Arendt thinks of as the lost treasure of the revolution, he would have to give up to live again in a sort of political system. But Arendt holds out this idea of these elementary republics and a politics of councils and wards as a new form of government. If you want her political theory, uh, her utopian or idealistic idea of what a free political system would be like, and in that sense, this is the conclusion of her political theory. Uh, I don't. I'll end there, and we'll try and take the rest in questions. Thanks very much. I look forward to the conversation. Like, this is a very challenging chapter. Uh, I really do think it's one of the harder chapters in her corpus. Um, the idea of corruption and public spirit versus private interest um, is actually quite she sort of skirts along it at times and doesn't, I think, um, unpack it with the specificity I would like. Um, that said, I find it to be incredibly provocative, and I hope you do too, and look forward to the conversation. So you can join either in the chat, or of course you can raise your hand and engage. Just a quick announcement. Uh, we're going to be on break for the next month. I hope you all have a very happy holidays when we get there. And we'll start the new book on January 23rd. It's Crises of the Republic, one of her really great books of essays. And I look forward to that discussion. We do have an end of year offer where if you give a nice gift to the center, you get a free copy of The Crises of the Republic. You can also just give a nice gift to the center if you already have it. But we do hope you'll support what we do as we go forward, and I thank you for that. All right, let's have our discussion. James, you're up.
Roger, I just want to say I'm reporting from the front. Over the couple of years that I've been in the group, I've been inspired to explore this idea of public space, public opinion, acting in public, talking in public, creating in public, and uh, which is not a really comfortable thing, hasn't been comfortable for me in my life because I'm used to spending all my time alone in a studio. Um, but this past October, November, I pulled 1,000 watercolors out of my studio and brought them into the library for the community to hang the pictures, put them where they wanted to put them, create their experience of what it was. So everybody was equal. It was their moment. I was totally out of control. And for a month and a half, I sat there and watched what happened to the show, to the experience, and it was amazing.
Mm.
Um, it brought me into contact with all kinds of people, all kinds of opinions, all kinds of impulses. And I just want to basically thank you and the group for inspiring me to create these spaces of public opinion. And in coincidentally, I've been meeting a lot of people in town who are interested in creating these spaces. So it continues. And the operation, the way we're working with it is a principle called subsidiarity, which is basically working closely to the impulse, to the event. The people that are close to the event take responsibility for the event. It doesn't get delegated to the town. And it's just a really fascinating celebration of what the Arendt Center seems to be about. I watched uh, Bill Jones's In a Dream You Saw a Way to Survive, and I was chuckling because if that were happening in my program, people would be throwing the apples back at people and across the room, and it's the next step, and nobody would have gotten hurt. So thank you, group. Thank you for your input to encourage me to explore this whole um, public space and sharing with my community. Rock and roll, baby.
Thank you, James. It's a beautiful idea, and um, I love this. First of all, I love what you did, and I love this idea of subsidiarity that you talk about. One of the things that RN does say about these councils is that there's no purpose to them, in the sense that you don't tell them you have to do this, you have to do that. They just meet and they talk, and we see what comes from them. Um, some of you know that we've been involved with these movements for citizen assemblies,
Yes.
and I have complicated relations to some of the ideas in them, but I think that they are important, and I support them. But in the end, one of the problems that I see with the current approach of citizen assemblies that are organized by groups who want to solve a particular issue, be it, where to put a stadium or what to do with land or whatever, is that the groups are convened for a purpose and are run by a kind of by a nonprofit or by a government that, in a sense, tasks the group with this problem. The pure form of citizen assemblies, as I see it, as it's now being tried in Belgium and in Paris and in other places, are permanent citizen assemblies where they're simply spaces where citizens are selected, funded, and they meet, and they can decide to do whatever they want. And And that to me is the next step. That doesn't mean I see the current movement in citizen assemblies as a way of teaching people how powerful this process of debating and deliberating and talking to others is, so that we can get to the permanent citizen assembly. But I think what you're talking about is beautiful, and what you're reporting is your experience, that people who come together and are part of these kind of communities love them and grow in them and find them to be about public happiness is exactly what Arendt and Jefferson have in mind. So thank you.
I have to say that watching a community over a month, 50, 60, 100 people rearrange your art, my art was I my heart was in my throat for over a month, but it was fascinating to be expose myself and see them take the authority of it. Yeah, Jenny Lynn Bader came in and the last day of the show and basically pulled a couple of hundred pieces off the wall, rearranged them all, and I was just like, oh,
Yep.
perfect,
Yep.
perfect. It was such being exposed and that vulnerable. I just, I don't know how to encourage people to do that. It
Thank you, James. I really appreciate it. That's
totally surprised me.
really helpful.
All
Thank you.
right, have fun.
Yep. Alex.
Thank you, Roger. I very much agree with the importance this book places on localism. I've tried to live my political life on that basis, being the mayor of my city. And I think one of the great problems with our constitutional structure is the absence of any constitutional standing for municipalities. And that has led to states across the country preempting more and more local powers and preventing localities and municipalities from adopting progressive policies that may be different than what the state wants. But my question to you is, I'm kind of surprised, and I know this may go back a little bit to the prior session, at the superficiality of her conclusion about the United States Senate and the United States Supreme Court, especially given the current practice. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about why she came to that conclusion and to what extent it was influenced by the kind of particularly progressive role of the Warren Court at the time she was writing this book. Because the Warren Court seems to fulfill some of her expectations about the role of the Supreme Court in renewing the constitutional values of the founding, but current practice would suggest that her emphasis on the court and the Senate are either superficial, totally mistaken, or ridiculous. And I wonder if you had a view on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So first of all, I agree with you 100% about the mistake in the Constitution and not recognizing municipalities. Um, I teach a constitutional law course, and my students will tell you that one of the finals that I usually give is a case in which the Supreme Court basically says to the city of uh, Pittsburgh and city of Allegheny in Pennsylvania, you guys have no standing because you're not even constitutionally recognized. Um, all that matters is what the state of Pennsylvania says, and that that idea I think is dangerous, and I'm with you. And as someone who has great respect for and belief in the power of mayors, um, I respect and thank you for your service and agree with what you're saying. Um, yeah, I think your question is a good one. I'll say this: I think that Arendt's um, discussion of the Supreme Court and the Senate have to be understood as taking place in a chapter called "The Lost Treasure of the Revolutionary Tradition." Right? Um, she doesn't think that necessarily these things have succeeded. Uh, she does think that both the court and the Senate were imagined by the founders as institutions that would, um, uh, for the court, acquire a kind of authority, and for the Senate, um, purify opinion. Um, that's the reason why the Senate was smaller, while it was longer. You serve for 6 years instead of two. Uh, why it was elected by the state legislatures rather than the people. Um, and so, part of this, Alex, is of course that the Senate today is no longer the Senate that we had, um, nor is the court in many ways the court we had, not just in the personnel, but both have become much more democratized in a way that, um, in a sense, uh, takes away the protection that they had as spaces of freedom, if you want to put it in her terms. You know, um, Arendt is an egalitarian in the sense that she believes that everyone should have the right to participate in self-government. Um, she's not a Democrat in that she believes that um, simply anyone should vote and the vote should manipulate politicians and politicians should do whatever the voters say. Um, it's a longer conversation. I don't want to say she's not a Democrat, because in many ways she is, but she doesn't love the idea of representation as doing what the voters tell us. And she respected the fact that the founders tried to create institutions like the Supreme Court and the Senate, which were insulated from the voters. She also found it very important that they created institutions like the House of Representatives and the president, which were responsive to the voters. She thought you needed both, right? One of the things we've done is we've taken away the insulation. And this leads to um, the dominance of what she calls corruption, that even bodies like the Senate and the Supreme Court have become responsive to private interests, have become less about deliberating societies that seek the public spirit, but have become more and more political and politicized. Uh, and so, I think you're right to a large degree that um, today these institutions are much less able, if they're able at all, and we can have that conversation, uh, to serve the function that she thinks they were designed to, and she thinks that at certain moments they have served. Um, whether there's still enough of a tradition of the Senate as the greatest deliberative body in the world, right? As it was often said, or the Supreme Court as a constitutional convention in constant session, whether those ideas are still powerful enough to, in a sense, pull the members of the court and the Senate away from the corrupting influences of the people and towards a public spirit, is, I think, an open question. I mean, I think you could say right now they're not doing a very good job of it. Um, uh, but I think that would be her hope. But yeah, I think everything you said is right. The problem, of course, is that in the name of making them more responsive to the people, we have made them more responsive to the corruption of the people in an egalitarian society from an Arendtian point of view. And that's the challenge. Bernie.
A couple of things. As educators, we get a glimpse into the world as it's unfolding from our students. And in my own experience, after my 17-year career as a litigator, to move into education, I've been at three different levels. The University of Florida, University of California, Santa Cruz, and then down at the level of the California community colleges. And the last one is my most recent, where when we talk about people that, you know, abstain from politics, and I learned from my students they abstain because they don't even know what politics are. They have no conception of why they would ever want to participate in them. Uh, they seem to just think it's ugly, and the best choice you can make is to know nothing about them. And so, imagining a representative democracy when a substantial chunk of it, wants nothing to do with it, you know, um, you know, I was frankly horrified in what I learned about our American prospects. The other thing is, as someone from Santa Cruz, there's a book written about it called The Leftmost City. So at one level, as you've been describing Hannah Arendt's uh, understanding of these citizen councils, our local Santa Cruz City Council, sounds an awful lot like, what Arendt was describing in the sense that, boy, anybody that wants to participate in city government certainly can and does. And city council people are very patient in letting everybody have the very last word that they want to have on any given matter of public understanding.
Right.
At another level, we have, Santa Cruz has become a bedroom community for Silicon Valley. And so even though everybody gets to have their say, the developers still have the final word. And you see that in the outcome of the votes. So I would, kind of put on your, how would Hannah Arendt analyze this grand participation, yet the elitists, the moneyed elitists, still
Yeah.
control the day?
Yeah, thanks, Bernie. So first of all, I really respect and love what you said about the students who are abstaining from politics. And I think what it's often forgotten is that abstaining from politics today is a completely rational decision. If you see the politics as corrupt, as as your vote not mattering, as even for whatever reason, for the numbers, it doesn't matter, or the rich and powerful are gonna get what they want anyway. Why should you bother, taking the time out of your day to educate yourself about it and vote? Um, one of the reasons I think the councils are important, and by the way, as wonderful as I'm sure the Santa Cruz, town council is, I don't think it's the same because there's still people in charge and other people come up and can say what they want, but there is a ruling and a ruled. I assume. Maybe in Santa Cruz it's different. Um, but the beauty of these smaller wards, right, from or council systems from RN's point of view, is that they're fun, that they bring joy back into it because people actually can talk about things and decide to do things, and they have power. They don't have to ask permission. They just do things. And and I think that a lot of your students who are disillusioned or don't know what politics is or just decide to leave it, if there was a space where they could go and grab a beer or a lemonade and or who knows what and talk to each other and say let's do this and have the ability to then pass a law or just do things, might find it empowering and fun as opposed to alienating. um uh you know uh, One of the another classic essay that I have my students read is PJ O'Rourke's Parliament of Whores. I don't know how many of you have come across the comedian or comic writer PJ O'Rourke. Um, but it's one of the great send-ups of a New England town meeting where, every crazy person with a view comes in and speaks and how boring and crazy it is. And I think that that's an important element of letting people participate and speak. But there's also something empowering about it, at least when you have this ability to act, and that's what Arendt is talking about. So yeah, what you're saying is, um, if people feel that it's all just a charade and in the end, the powerful are going to run it anyway. They're not going to get involved. And yet, it's not that. And we have to know that. I mean, look what's happened in the last 10 or 12 years, or last 30 years, if you want to put it in that way. A lot of people in this country who felt completely left out of politics and felt like the world was not listening to them, organized, took over town governments, took over school boards, started banning books, started electing different kinds of people, and created a political movement that is taking power from the class that has had it for many years in this country. Um, and the question is, when will the people in that class start doing the same thing? Um, and so I do think that it's easy to get disillusioned and easy to see it as there's no chance to do anything. But the lie to that is given by local institutions that simply meet and start doing things. And that's where Arendt understands power to lie and where the public spirit gets developed. So thank you. Who's next? John.
Hi, Roger. I want to call attention to something that Arendt says. It's on page 209 of the Penguin edition. Um, it's pretty strong. It's in the first full paragraph uh, where she says, "When we were told that by freedom we understood free enterprise, we did, that is, we Americans, did very little to dispel this monstrous falsehood. And all too often we have acted as though we too believed that it was wealth and abundance which were at stake in the post-war conflict between the revolutionary countries in the East and in the West." And then further on down in the page, she says, "Free enterprise, in other words, has been an unmixed blessing only in America, and it is a minor blessing compared with the truly political freedoms, such as freedom of speech and thought, of assembly and association, even under the best conditions. Economic growth may one day turn out to be a curse rather than a good, and under no conditions can it either lead into freedom or constitute a proof for its existence."
Yeah.
And that's pretty strong language, this monstrous falsehood. But it seems to me that this monstrous falsehood is the doctrine of American freedom, as espoused by somebody, say, like Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom. And it seems to me that when Arendt says that the meaning of life, or a meaningful life, is to appear to speak and act in public, whereas the meaning of life for the American capitalist system is to acquire private wealth, to become rich and prosperous. That's the meaning of life, as opposed to life in the public sphere. It's private sphere all the
Yeah.
way. All right. So I just wanted to note that she had a very strong attitude towards the confusion of freedom as the ability to produce wealth as opposed to speak and act in public.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. I mean, this is one of the, recurring themes of the book. I think we quoted those lines last class that we met, our last meeting, but it's really good to have them back because they're important. But it returns us also to the chapter on public happiness, right? And this is her argument, is that we have largely um, interpreted life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness along the lines of private happiness and uh, um, and the right to acquire and earn money and claim status, rather than public happiness, which she at least argues Jefferson likely or could have meant when he wrote Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Um, but this is part of her argument, is that um, the treasure of the American Revolution, the public spirit and the public happiness, have been lost. And there's a number of reasons they've been lost, right? One of which is what you just said, right? The focus on private acquisition and wealth or interest. Another is what she's here talking about in chapter 6, which is the lack of an institution to encourage public happiness for most people, for the vast majority of people. And that's what she's worried about in chapter 6, right? Um, because, I mean, we're never going to eradicate uh, public happiness. I'm sorry, we're never going to eradicate private happiness. Um, and, I think she's reconciled to that, right? People are always going to want to pursue their own interests. What you need is a counter to that. And you can only have a counter to that if there are institutions which promote it and teach you public happiness and give you the experience of it. And that's what she's here talking about in this last chapter is the lack of that kind of institution and the suffering that we engage in, that we experience for the lack of such an institution.
Yep.
Thank you. Lee.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. Two unrelated questions. One is about the Hungarian Revolution, which Arendt has some positive comments about. The exception being that the council system was not appropriate for the workplace, but the Hungarian Revolution essay was published in the 1958 edition of the Origins of Totalitarianism and has disappeared from any future anthologies that incorporate Arendt's work, which I may have missed. So, what was Arendt's attitude toward the Hungarian Revolution from 58 on? I know there were some critiques of the Hungarian Revolution. So, what's the status of that now with regard to Arendt's take on it back in the 50s? Second question is you mentioned that the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the executive were responsive to the voters. A third institution that has been responsive to the voters and is quite important in terms of who gets elected is the primary system, and the primary system was just really coming into its own in the 70s. Jimmy Carter was helped by the primary system, and so was Barack Obama. People I knew in England really thought we had a much better system than they did in England, where the prime minister was chosen by a party meeting where people had to vote here. So, Roger, I'd like to hear your comments on those two things I brought up. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Those are excellent questions. So the Hungarian Revolution captivated Hannah Arendt, right? She reviewed a long book on it, and she was very much taken by these councils, the Reta that emerged during the Hungarian Revolution. And she did think of it as an outbreak of freedom. First of all, it was an outbreak of freedom against Stalinism, and secondly, she really did think that these revolutionaries, these workers' councils, these student councils, these army councils, were signs of a new form of government. And so she wrote that long essay, that wonderful essay on the Hungarian Revolution, and she appended it to the end of the second edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism, I think for very good reason, thinking that, I mean, so remember what is the argument of The Origins of Totalitarianism? Well, one of the core arguments is that totalitarianism was a new form of government. It had never been seen before, and it responded to needs of the modern world, and that the old forms of government that we had, monarchy and tyranny, aristocracy and oligarchy, democracy and constitutional government, couldn't respond to. And in a sense, she wrote the essay, The Hungarian Revolution, as a way of thinking, well, maybe there's another new form of government, these council systems. And that idea is, I think, is what leads her in many ways to write On Revolution. So in many ways, I think On Revolution is the continuation of that interest. It doesn't only come from there. She's also very interested in her understanding of the Middle East, in Israel and Palestine, where she becomes convinced that a kind of local workers' councils and local neighborhood councils would be a better way to do politics in a federated system rather than a state, whether it's a Palestinian state or an Israeli state or a Jewish state. Why does the essay on Hungarian Revolution disappear? It's a riddle. The only person I've ever heard offer an answer to it is Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah.
In the original conference I had at the Arendt, starting the Arendt Center in 2006, I invited Christopher to come and speak, and he very graciously did. And in his talk, he asked the exact question you did, which is, why does this amazing essay disappear from her corpus? And his answer was that after she wrote it, and then she did more research on the Hungarian Revolution, she learned about the profound anti-Semitism that marred a lot of these local councils. And he thought, in a sense, pulled the essay because she didn't want to be celebrating these local councils that she turned out to be so anti-Semitic. Now, this raises an important question about federalism and about local councils, which is, as Tocqueville says in Democracy in America, the town hall meeting and town governance was the engine of democracy, and yet it was always potentially racist and potentially discriminatory. And what he says is that's just part of the price you have to pay for real democratic government. And there's a way in which I think Arendt probably agrees with Tocqueville on that, but I don't think in a book on the Holocaust and totalitarianism during the Holocaust, she was prepared to celebrate at the end of it the Hungarian Revolution, which turned out to be more riddled with anti-Semitism than she had realized. And so I don't know if that's correct. I have no one I know knows the answer to the question you asked. That's the only answer that has ever been proposed that I've come across that makes any sense, and it's at least out there. On your second question about primaries, I think that the primary system has turned out to be one of the greatest travesties of our politics. Arendt didn't know much about it. It was, as you said, it emerged later. It was obviously a response to elite governance and the smoke-filled room where a bunch of elites picked the president or the candidates. And that wasn't a great system either. But the primary system, especially in the age of gerrymandering, has become a disaster. because at this point, what you've done is created safe districts in over 90% of the congressional districts around the country. And um, what you do has you have a system in which you have a built-in incentive for the most radical candidates to win elections in primaries. Um, and then since you have a gerrymandered system, those radical candidates will almost always then win the general election. And that has been a disaster for our politics.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that the Republican candidate in the 2016 presidential election would have been Trump if there had been the back cigar filled backroom meeting.
Right. That's a different issue. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. It probably wouldn't have been, whether, you know, I mean, the problem is on that issue, you're talking about whether you'd rather have a bunch of plutocrats just pick the president or a bunch of, um, partisan voters. And I think they're both pretty poor choices. But, you know, and so, yes, you can criticize it that way, but I'm not sure the system that it replaced was any better. Um, that said, the combination of gerrymandering plus primaries has been an absolute disaster for our politics, and
Yeah,
we have to do something about that.
yeah.
Glenn,
Hey, as a quick aside, Roger, you should, as a fundraiser, crank out some VRG merch with some of James's one-liners on it. Roger, rock and roll could be or rock and roll or something could be your first one. Anyways, my
Glenn, you're
question is
hired.
short.
Glenn,
Sorry?
you're hired.
My question is short, and I don't want to try to say a version of what do you think Arendt would think about this, but I might have no choice. Do you think she would think that true opinion, which is the result of discussion and debate, could be formed on social media?
So can I first just correct you one? And if I said this, I apologize. She has no belief in anything called true opinion, and if I said true opinion, I apologize.
Probably my mistake. Opinion.
Yeah. I mean, opinion in the sense of uh, public spirited or public oriented opinion,
Right.
opposed to private interested opinion. So you're asking, can that come out of social media?
Yeah. How would she help me think about that when I go to Facebook, it asks me what's on my mind. Is that not my opinion or is that my mood?
Well, I mean, I think you know the answer to that. Um, I don't think there's anything inherent about social media that makes it bad. I mean, it is mediated online, and I think that in general, it's much. I mean, so let's start from the basics, Glenn, right? In order to have the kind of filtered purification of opinions that she's talking about, you have to talk to people and you have to learn to disagree and with people. It's much easier to do that in person over a meal or coffee or at a bar than it is online where, people are often not paying attention or, doing something else while you're talking to them. They don't even have to listen to you. They can be checking their emails. Um, and, and so I think, I mean, one of the, one of the, I say this is actually you guys are going to find this funny, right? I am an absolute opponent of online education. And here I am. I've been doing this for 13 years with you guys. I love what I do. Um, uh, so why am I an opponent of it? Well, I mean, we have to ask, ourselves. I mean, we've created a community over 13 years. And I think there's a lot of people on this community that are amazing and I love it. And it's become one of the most important parts of my life. It's very hard to do. But I think generally online education, is reduces attention. Look, there's 100 and some odd people who are on the call today. I think, I don't know, 130 or something at the beginning. How many, are paying attention, right? I don't know. But some of you are, and I really appreciate that. And I don't, and I don't mind if some people aren't or have it on while they're doing something else. That's great. But, if I'm going to teach students, who are paying me to teach them, I think that the way to teach them is in person, where I get energy from them, and I learn and they learn, and we engage each other. So I do think there's a problem with online education. I mean, I will tell you that when I'm done teaching this class online every Friday, I'm exhausted, absolutely exhausted. And it's because I have to bring all my energy to you guys, right? When I'm in a classroom, there's energy coming back at me. I get energized by teaching. It's hard, much harder to do this than it is to teach in person. And I'm a big believer in in-person education. So I think there's a time for online, and I love what we do, and I made time for it for 13 or 14 years. Um, I'm just telling you that I think there is one um, you know uh, uh, real drawback to social media, which is that it's not in person. After that, I think, it's you could do it well. Colin McGill, who's a friend and who spoke at one of our conferences about 3 or 4 years ago, developed an online tool called Polis, POL.is, right? Which uses algorithms not to feed you um, opinions that you find either enraging or that agree with you, but finds the opinions that you disagree with, but most people who disagree with them find the most interesting and worthwhile. And it's designed to bring you opinions that challenge you and yet are do so in a way that have been shown by for other people to actually make them stop and think. And governments around the world, including in Taiwan, have embraced this software in order to, do um, public polls about issues, about whether to use Uber or about gay marriage or whatever it is, as a way of getting people to talk and engage with opinions different from their own through social media. So I think it can be done. The problem is that to go back to one of the last questions, the incentives of the social media companies are not to create good conversation, they're to make money. And the way to make money is to get people angry. And, so the algorithms are all designed to enrage you. They're not designed to make you encounter opinions that make you think. So, there's no reason someone couldn't develop social media that works on a different algorithm, but the incentives are a little harder.
Thanks for doing this, Roger.
Yeah, thank you. I know we're quickly out of time, but because we're not going to be here for a while, I'll take the last three questions. Lori, David, and George. If people need to go, I understand. Thank you all very much, but I'm going to take these questions because we're not going to meet for another month.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Just briefly, I was excited to read her discussion about the wards and the councils because I really see the overlap or potential in using deliberative democratic processes to engage people in the citizens' experience. But I would make one comment. It's not just citizens speaking, it's actually citizens grappling with their other fellow citizens and coming to hard decisions that, that they will then act and implement on. So it isn't just opinions, it's something, dealing with the complexities. One thing that really struck me.
Short, brief, Lori, because we're over time. Yeah. So,
I realize she's not a Democrat, but her freedom to participate. You have to have other people to participate with, and to maintain that freedom. I think you also have a responsibility to participate. If you don't participate, there's no one to protect your freedom.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Anyhow, I'll leave it there.
It's a great point, Lori. I mean, all I'm going to say very quickly, she thinks that, many people will want to participate and should have the right to participate. And she is an egalitarian in that sense, not a Democrat, but an egalitarian. But she thinks that it's also a right to not participate if you don't want to. Maybe you and she disagree there. That's totally fine. But she thinks that's one of the fundamental rights to live a private life. David.
Hi. I think this where we want to go here now is the effective manifestation in our immediate circumstances of this council idea. The Citizens Assembly is an excellent element. I want to speak to a moment. There are places of participation in action that are currently available. I personally was in the commune movement a long time ago, but non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, and volunteer groups are examples of civic participation. I'm in Sarasota, Florida, and it's an epic. There's tens, hundreds and hundreds of these local groups that have all taken on whatever, children, homeless, etc. And that's a place that we can do. But the larger public sphere has been overwhelmed by plutocratic propaganda and has now taken over the federal government. This amazing billionaires agenda that's what's running the show. And because they have took over the media. And we don't pay enough attention to that because the alternative media, Roger, I love your stuff and it's fabulous. You got 130 people, but the orange guy has got, everybody, and he's on the front page of the New York Times every single day. And we're not, in our perspective, I'm not on television anywhere. But the thing that it is possible now is there suddenly, because this is so extreme up there, we've gotten clear that we need an area, an arena of action. Specifically, the implementing the sustainable development goals locally is one of my pet things. Mondami, though, is not, he's heard of. But the key thing here is the citizen volunteer assurance of the success of his initiatives. If they become the watchdogs and volunteer labor, then that's the arena of actually getting something done. And the No Kings deal completely lacks that still to move into civic action groups. What in your community could the community do something about, and even to talk about how we should fix whatever?
David, I appreciate it. I mean, I think we all want, look, I don't have any qualms about the number of people who watch or listen to me. I love every one of you, and I hope I hope it's valuable. I don't seek to reach that mass audience, although I certainly won't complain if more and more people do. Um, uh, I do hope that we are able to create new participatory mechanisms. We're working with many political figures in New York City, including the New York City Civic Engagement Commission and many other political leaders in New York. And I'm hopeful that in the next year to year and a half, we'll have a major citizen assembly in New York City. And it's something we've been working on for a number of years. So I'm hopeful that will happen. George, last question. George, you're muted, so you got to unmute yourself.
I'll be very brief. I just want to bring up a topic for future discussion. If we're going to just ignore or make fun of the billionaire's agenda, we're in trouble because there's an intellectual aspect and a moral aspect behind it. And it's the question, it's an Augustinian question, but also Rabbi Hillel. And that's Ordo Amoris. And I think we should talk about that at one time.
What is it?
Something that Pope Francis chided our vice president about, and I think it's very important to this discussion because it's just their answer to what we're talking about today.
What is it? I didn't hear what you said.
Ordo Amoris, the
What is that?
order of love. It's an Augustinian concept, and it's used by the Wright Moguls and J.D. Vance, and also by Rabbi Hillel. It's a concentric care concept, and it's very important now, and we just ignore it. We don't even talk about it. It's a direct answer to what we've been talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. I have to admit I don't know the term, so I'll have to look into it.
I think it's very important now, and it's also if you look at the You see, many of us don't look at what the opposition has to say. We just assume that, that what we say about the opposition is all this.
Well, I've read a lot of the opposition, George. I haven't heard of Odora, Ordo, or Morris, but I'll look into it. But what Arendt does say, right, and we talked about it in this section on the social question, is that for her, solidarity cannot be based in pity, but it has to be based in a solidarity with all, including the rich and the poor. And I don't know if that's what Ordo or Morris is.
Ordo Morris is take care of yourself and your family first, and then your neighbors, and then your country, and then the rest of the
Oh,
world.
I see. Yeah, I mean, uh, that would not be her idea of solidarity,
Absolutely.
but it is another view. We actually I discussed a fair bit about that in the conference we had a couple of years ago on tribalism and cosmopolitanism. And in a way that's the tribalist viewpoint. And I think, as I said in that conference, I think there's a lot to recommend it that has to at least exist in tension with and alongside the cosmopolitan viewpoint. So I think you need both. In any case, thank you all very much. This has been wonderful. If you have it in your plans to give to support groups during the holidays, we at the RN Center would love to have your support. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the holidays. Have a very happy and restful break, and we'll see you with Crisis of the Republic on January 23rd.